Now, former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte has taken charge as the new NATO chief. NATO officials expect Rutte to maintain Stoltenberg's priorities at the 32-member alliance, rallying support for Ukraine, pushing NATO countries to spend more on defense, and keeping the US engaged in European security.
My second priority is to step up our support for Ukraine and bring it ever closer to NATO. Because there can be no lasting security in Europe without a strong, independent Ukraine. I know from personal experience with the downing of flight MH17 in 2014 how conflict in Ukraine is not contained to the front lines. So we must do our part.
Let's flesh this out a little bit more. We're joined now by DW's political correspondent Thomas Barrow, live from Berlin. Good afternoon to you. Thomas, now the war in Ukraine and an escalating widening conflict in the Middle East, or West Asia as we call it here. Mark Rutte's slate of challenges looks as full as that of his predecessor. Now, would he handle them any differently?
Absolutely. Well, it depends. On the one hand, obviously, Mark Rutte wants to set his own tone. He wants to set his own agenda. He wants to leave his own mark. But it is expected that there will be a high degree of continuity. On the one hand, because of the challenges that you mentioned, from Ukraine to the situation in the Middle East to other challenges, security challenges specifically in Europe. And on the other hand, because one of the key elements of the NATO alliance is that you have all these different countries with different priorities, with different defense spending as well. So one of the key elements, one of the key challenges that Mark Rutte will specifically have is not only looking outside of the alliance, but also focusing internally on how these different countries, for example, will increase their military spending, how they will come to common ground on topics where they do not see eye to eye, and obviously, very importantly now also, how they will work with the United States as one of the key NATO members in particular.
Yes, and how is then NATO under Mark Rutte likely to tackle a situation where Donald Trump becomes the next US president, considering his negative views about the alliance and its backing of Ukraine?
There's hope, at least if you view it from Europe, about Mark Rutte leading the alliance, because he's seen as a Trump whisperer, referring to a situation while he was the leader of the Netherlands, where he managed to speak to Trump about the priorities of the NATO alliance. And since then, he's known to be someone who has a link to the former US president when it comes to dealing and discussing these issues. But Mark Rutte and his team have also been very clear that the NATO alliance has to work, and in particular European countries have to work with whoever is in the White House. So whether it is Donald Trump or whether it is Kamala Harris, European partners in NATO have to work with the United States and have to try and find common ground. Beyond this, it's also important that Mark Rutte, and this is a key challenge also in the last few years, has clearly understood that at a time when the United States is looking inward, at a time when the United States in its foreign policy is focusing on the Asia-Pacific, that Europe has to do much more for its own defense. And that's why one of the priorities will also be to try and make sure that European members of NATO increase even more their defense spending to tackle some of the issues and challenges that we've been discussing here, like the war in Ukraine.
Thomas Barrow, thank you so much for joining us from Berlin.